You left out some important information, but that is the gist of it.
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, we've made some pretty great theory videos, broken down the ending, talked about the Easter eggs, but now I want to really get into what this movie really means and what it's trying to say. The movie is filled with big ideas like utopianism, eugenics, religion, Genesis, deism, creationism, trauma, and we're going to unpack all of that. But the theme of the movie, the one thing that unites all of these elements, is empathy. James Gunn even spelled this out in a tweet, saying, "At the end of the day, this is a movie about joy and compassion and learning to see beyond the rim of our own worlds and having empathy for all living things."
But what does empathy even mean?
Well, it means to understand and share the feelings of another. In other words, it's the ability to see the world from someone else's point of view. Empathy is the great argument killer, and it's the crux of the kind of peaceful society that the High Evolutionary is trying to build. The arc of this team over 3 movies has been to overcome trauma and learn to empathize with others. Like when Nebula forced Gamora to understand how her endless quest to win ruined her life.
You were the one who wanted to win, and I just wanted a sister!
Guardians 1 was about the team setting aside their personal desires to work for the good of a collective. Guardians 2 was about the team overcoming their own personal egos to conquer the ego. And Guardians 3 is about the characters finally understanding one another. Oh, and by the way, everyone, before we get too far into this video, I want to show you this very cool Doug as Rocket tee.
Oh my god, that is incredibly cool.
It sure is, and we have lots of sweet teas in our merch store, and shopping with us is the best way you can support our channel. Thanks for being here with us. Check out the link in the description below. So this film is filled with people trying to understand one another. Peter tries to explain to Gamora what they had in another life.
Maybe if you open yourself up to it, there's a possibility.
I don't think so, Quinn.
When the Bowie lands on Counter-Earth, the team struggles to communicate what they want. And Peter has to find a way to communicate with the Batwoman, at first by screaming at her like a tourist, but eventually they communicate through the act of art when Peter draws the man they're looking for. Art is actually a great unifier across societies because it creates something that many cultures can empathize with. For instance, in The Wizard of Oz, pretty much everybody everywhere on the planet can relate to the simple goal of trying to get home. And later in the movie, Nebula struggles to communicate with the children, but Drax immediately knows how to speak to kids, first by dancing like a monkey, but then literally by speaking their language. The character with the greatest arc to learn empathy is Adam Warlock. He begins the movie serving the High Evolutionary because he only wants to save his civilization. He's only concerned for his people. But then he misunderstands his mom's order to show him we mean business, and he sees how his actions have hurt Blurp's feelings. Adam then says, "I don't like how this makes me feel," because he is empathizing with the pet, and so he takes him in. Adam eventually becomes a hero because Groot empathizes with him. Groot saves his life, saying everyone deserves a second chance. See, all of the Guardians have been given a second chance to reinvent their lives, but especially Groot because he is the son of a tree that sacrificed himself for the others.
We are
Groot's empathy for Warlock not only saves Adam, but it eventually saves Peter when Warlock saves his life. The lesson here is that empathy creates a society where people work together for mutual benefit. And later when we talk about the High Evolutionary's perfect society, we'll see that the missing element there was empathy. So with this central theme of empathy, Mantis has become the most important character in the movie. Her powers have always been really underrated. See, she is an empath who can feel the emotions of others. But this power also helps her to understand everybody's emotions even better than they understand them. Like, she would make a great therapist. For example, look at the Abelisks. The Guardians fought one of these in Volume 2, so we just assume they're big, bloodthirsty monsters. The High Evolutionary also believes they're monsters, so he sicks them on the team. But Mantis sees them for who they really are. Scared animals that only want to eat batteries. Mantis is always looking out for others and trying to see past their crusty exteriors.
I was screaming at something scary behind you, not you. You look really cool.
Thank you!
She's the one who sees past Peter's trauma and encourages him to heal. When Peter says that his granddad screamed at him, Nebula tries to empathize with his grandfather, saying that he was probably just trying to protect Peter. But Mantis's great achievement in the movie is probably when she finally gets through to Nebula. Nebula spends the movie, and actually every movie, criticizing others. She screams at Mantis for losing their suits, screams at Drax for being Drax. And the reason Nebula does this is because this is how she was raised. Thanos was hypercritical of her, even replacing the parts parts of her that displeased him. So Nebula is always trying to find flaws in others because that's how she was raised. But Mantis finally tells her to stop finding fault in everyone. They love Drax because of his flaws and not in spite of them. Drax is dumb, but if he weren't dumb, then he wouldn't make them laugh. This also fits in nicely with the movie's theme of finding beauty in imperfections, which we'll talk about a bit later on. The Guardians have always been united by their trauma. It's the one thing they've always had in common. Trauma creates a need for connection, and in this movie we see that Rocket's trauma created his first connection with his friends. The very first words that Rocket ever says are hurt, and his pain prompts Lila to lick a cloth and then use it to soothe his wound. So we see that pain creates empathy, which creates friendship, community, and understanding. Peter makes friends with the Batwoman in the same way, by using a cloth to a cut on her leg. In fact, a lot of this movie is about people empathizing with Peter and Peter learning to empathize with Gamora. For instance, the whole monologue in the elevator when he says,
And then I lost my temper and nearly destroyed half the universe.
This is Peter giving his side of the story to the audience after he royally screwed the pooch in Infinity War. The internet rioted after that movie, saying everything was Star-Lord's fault, and now we finally get his side of the story. But more importantly, Peter comes to understand this new version of Gamora. Remember, his Gamora was killed by Thanos in Infinity War, and this version is from 2014. The last time they met, this happened. So Peter spends this entire movie idealizing this version of Gamora, trying to force her into being who he imagines her to be. It's a kind of fetishization that is unhealthy and is borderline stalker behavior. Now this is because Peter does not see Gamora for who she is, only who he wants her to be. And in the same way, Gamora lacks any empathy for the group. She only sticks with them to keep her sister safe. In other words, to protect her own family. Much like Adam Warlock was only trying to protect his own family. But after Gamora sees how important Rocket is to everybody, she puts her own life on the line to save his. Now she starts off the movie by calling Peter Quinn and keeping him at arm's length. But by the end of the movie, she understands what she saw in him when she says, I bet we were fun. And Peter understands that Gamora is lost to him, and he's finally able to confront his trauma and move past it. Gamora also begins the movie not believing that Groot is actually speaking, kind of like Peter in the first movie.
I'm Groot.
Yeah, you said that.
But near the end, she understands him without even noticing she's doing it. And then, in one of the final scenes, we, the audience, actually hear Groot say,
I love you guys.
Now this isn't because Groot can suddenly speak. Notice how nobody else reacts to this change in vocabulary. It's because in this moment, we the audience are able to fully empathize with Groot, so we are able to understand him as well. So the journey of all the heroes is to discover empathy, and they are opposed by the High Evolutionary, who represents the opposite of empathy, which is apathy or maybe even antipathy. Now apathy means total disinterest in someone else, while antipathy is more like outright dislike of someone else. The High Evolutionary rides this line perfectly. He either outright hates his creations, like Rocket, or he sees no value in their existence, like all the cute Zootopia people on Counter-Earth. Now this is because the High Evolutionary sees his creations as possessions. To him, they're objects. To underscore this, he only ever calls Rocket by his serial number 89P13. Now as we pointed out in our Easter egg video, this is very much like the musical Les Mis. A police officer named Javert is obsessed with an escaped convict named Jean Valjean, whose prisoner number is
Prisoner 24601.
Now over the years, Valjean turns his life around, becomes a mayor, starts a factory, raises a family, but even then, Javert cannot empathize with him, still calling him
24601.
Javert sees Valjean as less than human, as a criminal who is only defined by his number. And for the High Evolutionary, calling Rocket by his serial number is a way to dehumanize him, or depersonize him. I'm not sure what the term would be for a raccoon. See, during the Holocaust, Nazis tattooed numbers on Jews' arms, so these human beings could be cataloged and recorded like cattle or possessions. This dehumanized the Nazis' victims by turning them into objects, and the High Evolutionary regards Rocket as a possession. He's even offended when Rocket dares to ask when he can go to the New World. Later, he even screams at him, saying, "How dare you think you were more, 89P13?" And this is part of the movie's emphasis on the power of names. Lila convinces all of the animals to give themselves names to express who they are. Choosing a name and sharing your name with others is a way of forging your identity and defining how others see you. But the High Evolutionary will only ever see his creations as living data, numbers to be thrown around. He has divided life forms into two categories, life that matters and life that doesn't. Any life he creates is his to dispose of, and in his eyes, a lower life form. Now later in the movie, we see Rocket parroting this idea when he says we're all going to go save the higher life forms. And this is where the ideas about names names, empathy, and reconciling trauma all come together. Rocket opens the movie singing along to the song Creep. The lyrics are about a singer who essentially hates himself, who says, "I want a perfect body, I want a perfect soul." Rocket believes that he is imperfect and unlovable because his parent, the high evolutionary, told him he was imperfect and unlovable. All through the movie, people misname Rocket as a badger and a squirrel, and every time somebody calls him a raccoon, he corrects them. But then there's a moment when they've evacuated the higher life forms, and then Rocket sees the cages filled with animals. He remembers his time with Lila, Teefs, and Floor, and suddenly he empathizes with the raccoon kits. He goes back for them because he sees a piece of himself inside of them, and vice versa. This is the moment he truly stops running from his past trauma and confronts it. And then we see the sign that says what he is, a raccoon. Afterwards, he makes his past part of his identity, his name, by finally calling himself Rocket Raccoon. And God, did I cry like a little baby who dropped the lollipop in the dirt, could never have it, unsalvageable, deep, deep cry. Now, James Gunn has said in a Facebook post that animals are very important to him, and the final act of this movie shows this, with scores of animals being rescued by the heroes. And these animals were only ever in danger because the high evolutionary only saw them as a means to an end. And in the big action scenes like the hallway fight and versus the high evolutionary, the Guardians only succeeded because they worked together, because empathy was their secret weapon. Meanwhile, the high evolutionary kills everybody who works for him. Now, this is his expression of solipsism, or the idea that he is the only being in the universe that is real or that matters. And actually, I guess solipsism is kind of the opposite of empathy, because his actions isolate himself and he dies alone and afraid. And this is because the high evolutionary believed that he, and he alone, could fix the universe and make it perfect. And if you want to make something perfect, you're inherently saying that it's imperfect and needs fixing. This is a rejection of empathy, because the high evolutionary cannot accept people for who they are, only what he wants them to be. And he tells Rocket this directly, translating song lyrics from an opera, "Be not as you are, but as you should be." He tells Rocket that it is their sacred mission to take a cacophony of sounds and shape them into order, into music. And that's essentially what music is. It's sounds that are tuned together to create something harmonious. This harmony is a metaphor for the high evolutionary's perfect society. The high evolutionary's stated goal is to create a utopia.
Ah yes, a place where all the letter U's can go to get some space from those darn O's.
No, actually, Doug, the term was coined by Sir Thomas More for his 1516 book Utopia, describing a fictional island society in the New World. This island society would be a perfect society, isolated from the ills of the rest of planet Earth, and a place where everybody worked in harmony. It's also a complete fiction and not remotely possible.
That wasn't real.
The word utopia even translates from the Greek into no place. So utopia literally means non-existent society. Now, had it been spelled with an EU, like the word euphoria, it would have meant good place.
You're in the good place.
But that's not how we spell it, so utopians are, by definition, chasing a fiction.
This is the bad place!
Beef, beef, beef.
And Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 does a brilliant job of spelling out why a utopia can never exist. Professor Lyman Tower Sargent argued that the utopian ideal is inherently contradictory because people are not homogenous. We're all a little bit different from each other. And the more of us there are, the more we will disagree. And as a society, we can't even agree on the color of this dress. Ironically, for everyone to get along, we don't need to agree on the color of the dress. We just need to accept that other people see it differently from ourselves. In other words, we have to have empathy with each other. But the high evolutionary does not want a world with empathy. He wants a world of order. And the movie shows him trying to create this world on counter Earth. It's also so appropriate that his perfect world is modeled after a suburban household in the 1980s. The suburbs are areas outside of cities. They're usually planned communities aimed at people who are tired of living city life and want more space and safer streets. And the 1950s, middle class and upper middle class families fled the cities to move into these new communities, which promised ant-like conformity at a price you could afford. The 1950s were an era where conformity became a commercial product. Products were advertised as this amazing thing that everyone else is using, so you don't want to get left out. This era also saw the rise of the nuclear family, this idea of the perfect American home that was exemplified on sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver or Ozzie and Harriet. In post-war America, it seemed like a better tomorrow was assured, and we were slowly moving toward a utopia. But of course, this was a lie.
You sit on a throne of lies.
Many of these artificial suburban communities excluded African Americans and other minorities, and moving to these communities was a way of ignoring society's problems rather than fixing them. And even in the high evolutionary's perfect suburbs, individualism finds a way to shine through. Genetically, these people should be docile, but their environment changed them. Some people become drug addicts or gangsters. This scene where we see the imperfect society is set to Alice Cooper's song, "I'm Always Chasing Rainbows." The song is about always striving for happiness at the end of a rainbow, but Since you can never actually reach the end of a rainbow, happiness is unachievable. Unachievable, just like the High Evolutionaries' Utopia. And the counterpoint to this song is actually the dog days are over at the end of the movie, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. You see, nowhere is a society that celebrates people's differences and everybody can live in harmony. But the High Evolutionary tries to accomplish his harmonious society through eugenics.
What's eugenics?
It's weird hearing you say that word. Eugenics was invented by a piece of shit named Francis Galton. Now, Galton invented the idea of social Darwinism. So Darwinism is the observed scientific principle that life slowly evolves over millions of years to adapt to a particular set of circumstances. Social Darwinism is the made-up belief that certain races of people are more suited to survive than others. Unfortunately, this idea went mainstream in the early 20th century. In 1907, Indiana passed a law allowing for the forced sterilization of people with disabilities. And the vast majority of these people were women who were overwhelmingly poor, minorities, or immigrants. In 1927, the Supreme Court said that the state of Virginia could sterilize a woman who was, quote, feeble-minded. It is estimated that between 60 and 70,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States during the 20th century.
Yeah, that's messed up.
Yes, and it wasn't just the crazies. Winston Churchill was a member of the British Eugenics Society. And this whole idea was seized by Hitler and the Nazi Party, who believed that a German utopia was achievable through perfected genetics, which they tried to achieve through torture and genocide. Just like the High Evolutionary, who created rocket through torture and then routinely commits genocide against his creations, whereas he viewed himself as the Ubermensch.
What's the Ubermensch?
Again, weird to hear you say that. The philosopher Nietzsche conceived of this imaginary person, the Ubermensch, as somebody who was the ultimate man, somebody who was beyond notions of good and evil. In other words, an asshole.
What a bunch of a-holes.
So all of these learned doctors and philosophers conceived of a system that relied on the perfect man, the perfect genes, the perfect society, and this is a lie because perfection does not exist. And I learned that by watching the 1991 sitcom The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Now this groundbreaking Nickelodeon show, which for some reason is not on streaming anywhere, featured an episode called Inspector 34, where the titular inspector comes to town and shows the people how to live a life of perfection. Little Pete gets caught up in this, enforcing draconian perfection onto the entire town. But then Inspector 34 eats barbecue chicken without getting messy, and everybody realizes that he missed the point.
You're supposed to use your hands.
It just tastes better that way.
So, bring that back to the High Evolutionary. By trying to accelerate through millions of years of evolution, he misses the point of evolution. Evolution is essentially a collection of mistakes that we have learned from. Like Master Yoda says,
The greatest teacher, failure is.
there can be no evolution without mistakes, without trial and error. So a species with accelerated evolution could never be perfect. We are shaped by our imperfections. Adam makes the mistake of killing a guy, but that mistake makes him want to be a better person. And this causes Adam to care for Blurp because he feels bad for destroying his master. In other words, Warlock feels empathy for Blurp. See, Blurp is the kind of creature that the High Evolutionary would rather see destroyed because it serves no functional purpose. Aisha even tells Adam to kill it, saying it doesn't belong here. But Adam keeps Blurp because he instinctively realizes that not everything needs a purpose. Sometimes people and pets just make you feel good.
Because I didn't understand why people care so much about their dumb dogs. Until I got a dumb dog myself.
Yeah, like how you make me feel good.
Exactly like that. But the High Evolutionary cannot just accept people for who they are, only for what they are not. Or, as Rocket says,
He didn't want to make things perfect. He just hated things the way they are.
Now, the High Evolutionary was the perfect villain for the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Obviously, there's a personal connection to Rocket's past, which has been teased since the first movie.
Why didn't it have to get made?
But more importantly, the High Evolutionary has this idea that the perfect society is achievable through the perfect race of people. And the Guardians have always been about showing the beauty in imperfections. They're all outcasts and weirdos who will never fit into normal society. And yet, they're the ones who can save the universe again and again. So the conflict at the end of Volume 3 is as much ideological as it is physical. And this reminds me of another science fiction movie about evolution and control. 2001, A Space Odyssey. Gunn packs a few different references to 2001 in this film. He confirmed that the spacesuits are modeled from the suits in 2001. The hamster wheel that Philo runs on is similar to the famous space station jog from that film. And there's also like the red security lights of the orgoscope, like when they deactivate HAL 9000.
Hey, I'm confused. I never saw that movie. What's it about?
Well, the film is essentially about the evolution of the human race. It begins at the dawn of man, when apes are inspired by a giant obelisk to begin using tools. Another obelisk sends humans to Jupiter, where the ship's computer, HAL 9000, kills the crew because it believes that the humans are a danger to the mission. And HAL 9000 also kills the humans because he believes that he is superior and more capable of completing their goals. However, HAL 9000 would never be able to complete their mission because he is merely a tool. He's just a more elaborate bone to be used by the human race. The reason the obelisk drew humans to Jupiter was to send them into a wormhole that would connect them to this alien race. And this race helps humanity evolve to the next step in their evolution, a giant space baby. Now, in this scenario, the high evolutionary is HAL 9000, someone who believes that there is a very specific, ordered way to progress forward. But in reality, only a human being, a messy, wet, mistake-making sack of water that smiles, could evolve into a space baby simply because human beings are flawed. In David's vision, he becomes old, he breaks a glass, he's flawed and makes mistakes, but these mistakes are what make him imperfect and thus capable of improvement and change. You see, the high evolutionary's quest for perfection is actually a quest for control. He wants the universe to obey his laws and to be subservient to what he thinks is the right way to exist. A perfect universe is a subservient universe that is grateful to him. This is why he hates Rocket so much. Rocket is a genius, even smarter than the high evolutionary, but the high evolutionary doesn't understand how his creation could surpass him. As he tells him, he was never meant for the new world. He is imperfect and unlovable. Even when Rocket is fixing his machines, the high evolutionary gets annoyed at his improper grammar, correcting how he says can't to can't. Like that time Sean made fun of me for pronouncing the word cement as cement. Yeah, Sean, I remember that, and now all the people watching this also think that you're a jerk.
Yeah, you suck, Sean.
High five. You see, the high evolutionary hates Rocket because the raccoon reminds him of his own imperfections. He sees Rocket as fundamentally flawed, but his grammar is terrible, so he can't understand why such a flawed creature was able to surpass him. And he also can never understand why Rocket is so intelligent. So this means that the high evolutionary, as his creator, has a flaw. So Rocket is a constant reminder of his creator's imperfections. And after the raccoon tears apart his face, Rocket becomes a reminder of his physical imperfection as well. So rather than just accept Rocket for who he is and learn from him, his solution is to cut him open and study his organs, as John Craigie would sing, dissecting the bird to get to the song. But the movie implies that there's another connection between Rocket and those early humans of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Both of them are able to evolve because they have a divine spark within them. In 2001, this divine spark was formed by the alien beings who sent the obelisk to Earth. But in Guardians 3, that divine spark comes from God.
It was God!
That's right, James Gunn has made the most religious movie in the MCU, and this franchise features 4 movies with a god as the lead character, plus the Loki series.
Yeah, are you sure this seems like a reach?
It is not a reach. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Gunn said, "I was raised Catholic, and I still pray sometimes, but I don't really identify with any particular religion. I believe in a higher power, but I don't know what that higher power is. I think it's something that's beyond our understanding." And that fits right in with how God is depicted in this movie. In the first scene in this movie, the hand of a scientist, or the hand of God, reaches out toward the raccoons. All the animals shy away except for Rocket. Something about him is special. Call it intellectual curiosity, or say that he was chosen by a divine force that sits above the high evolutionary. When Lila meets Rocket in the afterlife, Rocket tells her they made us for nothing, stupid experiments to be thrown away. And then she answers, there are the hands that made us, and then there are the hands that made the hands. Basically telling him that there is a higher power at play, and that he has been chosen by that power to do good in the world. And this divine spark is why Rocket is the only creation of the high evolutionaries who, in his words, knows true invention. This scene with Lila shows us the movie's real conflict is between a force that guides the universe, or God if you will, fighting to stop a false god, the high evolutionary. This higher power can give Rocket that intellectual spark that the high evolutionary can never understand. As the high evolutionary says, a populace unable to think what has not already been thought will die on the vine. So, as a creator, the high evolutionary will never be as powerful as like the God, the original creator of everything. Even though, look, this guy has one hell of a god complex. Before we even see him, Gamora says that entire worlds worship him as a god. On Counter-Earth, there's a statue of him, and a baby even has like a knitted doll made in his image. There's little touches throughout the movie, like how his underlings bring him a box to appear taller than Aisha. He wants her to look up at him in fear and wonder, like he's a god. When really, Rocket is much smaller and a lot more intelligent. The high evolutionary doesn't seem to believe in intelligent design. He believes that the world was chaotic, unguided. This belief is called deism. It's the idea that God created the world but then left to go create something else, and then everything's kind of fallen into place since then. Several founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, were deists. So the high evolutionary believes that he is the new intelligent designer of the universe. His ridicule of the old gods is apparent when he screams, "Fire everything we have at that dead God." He even says at one point, "There is no God, that's why I stepped in. So it's hard to hear this and not think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This was the very first science fiction novel, and it's about a scientist trying to replicate the work of God, to create life. And that's exactly who the High Evolutionary is. Dr. Frankenstein's creation is a product of science, but it's also a violation of nature. The monster's existence disrupts the natural order of things, and it only leads to violence and destruction. Just like how the High Evolutionary's actions lead to destruction and suffering because of his quest to replace the spiritual with the scientific. And also, the movie contains like so many biblical allegories. So let's start with the book of Genesis. The High Evolutionary is obsessed with creating an Eden, a paradise, but his creations always ruin this paradise with their individuality. This is just like the biblical Garden of Eden. God created a paradise for Adam and Eve, but when they ate from the tree of knowledge, they could never return. So I've always thought that the garden wasn't literal. It's a metaphor for growing up. We reach a certain age, we realize we're naked, we wear clothes, we learn about the world, and then we forever lose the idyllic paradise that childhood gave us. And this is basically what happens to Rocket when he eats from the tree of knowledge. He gets smarter, he spends more time at the High Evolutionary, then he learns that they're all going to be killed, and then his friends are murdered. He is forever banished from the childhood Garden of Eden, and he can never return to the happy days when he danced with his friends. There's also a couple of literal nods to Genesis in the movie.
I can feel it curling in the air tonight.
Actually, Doug, that was from Phil Collins' solo work, not from Genesis. That hand that reaches for Rocket and Adam Warlock saving Peter are both framed as the moment God gave life to Adam, as depicted in the Sistine Chapel. But, as we learned in Westworld, Michelangelo actually concealed God inside of a brain to imply that our consciousness was actually derived from our intelligence. The God of Genesis was also similar to the High Evolutionary in that he was very vengeful and violent. He destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, just like how the High Evolutionary destroyed Counter-Earth. He even tells Aisha, "It's my right as your maker to destroy you." And God also destroyed the entire world with the flood, sparing only the people and animals that were on Noah's Ark. And the High Evolutionary's pyramid is filled with the life forms that he deems worth saving, just like the Ark. And speaking of his pyramid, pyramids are always used as a symbol of the divine. The dollar bill has a pyramid with an eye at the top, a symbol of the eye of providence or the eye of God. Pharaohs were considered to be living gods, and they were laid to rest in pyramids until the day they were to be resurrected. But they were also false gods who rotted in their pyramids, just like another false god, the High Evolutionary, who likely died alone in his pyramid. And the final battle of the movie is people inside of a dead god fighting a false god. Doesn't really get more biblical than that. The Bible is filled with stories of the tribes of Israel taking on the worshippers of false gods, destroying shrines to Baal, conquering the Philistines. But also, the movie doesn't just include nods to Western religion. To use the arrow, Kraglin has to achieve a kind of meditative state to find nirvana. This sense of balance is much more in line with Eastern religions, in particular Buddhism and Hinduism. This is also the final moment when Kraglin is able to reconcile his own trauma, the guilt of betraying his mentor Yondu. He finally sees himself as a worthy successor, and he can finally aim true. And this is really the journey of every Guardian in this movie, finally healing from their past traumas, moving past their problems, and then they're able to make the universe a better place. Nebula decides that she's going to fix Thanos' mistakes instead of dwelling on them. She's going to raise the children to give them the life that she never had. Also, she spent her entire life destroying civilizations, and now she can finally build one. And now that she's no longer looking inward, she's able to look outward and help other people find their purpose. She sees that Drax's true calling is to be a father figure to the kids and not to be a destroyer. Remember, Drax became a destroyer to avenge his family's deaths.
Ronan murdered my wife, Ovet. And my daughter can marry you.
And now he can put the life of death and destruction behind him and focus on raising a new life. And of course, Peter returns to Earth. The series began with him leaving, and he's constantly talked about how much Earth sucks.
Earth? Earth is the place where my mother died in front of me. I'm half human, so that 50% of me that's stupid, that's 100% you.
You see, Peter's emotional growth was stunted when he was taken away in 1989. So in many ways, he's still stuck in that same era. All of his references are from that time period.
There's a legend about people like you. It's called Footloose.
Hell, he even kept a Panthro action figure in his backpack, which is actually a cool nod to the Ani-Men that we didn't include in our Easter egg breakdown. And then for decades, Peter couldn't bring himself to even open up his mother's final present to him. So in many ways, Peter, like our pop culture, is kind of cemented in the 1980s. And this was symbolized by Counter-Earth also being frozen in this decade. See, this was a perfect idyllic time in Peter's life, his childhood, his Garden of Eden. So the High Evolutionary symbolically also used this era to be his Garden of Eden. Its destruction is a literal reminder to Peter Peter that this perfect world only existed in his mind, and now he can go back home to confront his past. It's also extremely sweet that his grandfather knew Peter on sight. And of course, the movie is bookended with the Zune playing music over the speakers on Nowhere. In the first scene, Rocket is alone, dwelling on his imperfect body, focused on himself. But in the last scene, he is dancing to the song The Dog Days Are Over, a song that's about a woman who is trying to deny herself happiness, but happiness finds her anyways. Just like for the Guardians, they've told themselves a lie for years. The lie that they are ugly, that they're imperfect, the lie that they're unlovable. But after they see the world through one another's eyes, they understand how wonderful and lucky they really are to have found each other. The song is about seeing a light at the end of the tunnel and knowing that even when things are at their lowest, someday the dog days will be over and those bad times will only be in the past. The final dance is the ultimate celebration of survival, empathy, and love. So I just want to thank the entire crew who's worked on this video and all the Guardians of the Galaxy videos we've been doing. Keep it subscribed right here to ScreenCrush and let me know your thoughts down in the movies below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.